In this video, we're going to look at what life was like for a soldier in the Civil War. Both armies carried an assortment of flags. They were not only national flags, but regimental flags. In the North, some Irish-dominated units even carried Irish flags. Flags were carried by honor guards, which was considered, as its name implies, an honor for those selected. Here you can see a reenactment of an honor guard on the left. No, there aren't cars in the Civil War. You see in the back there. But in battle, you couldn't let the flag fall and touch the ground. You required, if the honor guard was hit, you'd have to pick up the flag. Don't let the flag touch the ground. So that the honor guard was an honor, but it was dangerous. Early on, the unofficial flag of secession was considered the Bonnie Blue flag. It was originally from West Florida and had a large, simple white star on a blue field. It was often mentioned in song and film after the war. If you ever seen the movie Gone with the Wind, where the character Rhett Butler names his daughter Bonnie because her eyes were blue, like the Bonnie Blue flag. The Confederate Congress, after the war began, adopted the first national flag, the so-called Stars and Bars. Here you can see the flag before the Upper South seceded. Because the stars and bars could be confusing in battle, the Army of Northern Virginia soon adopted a new design on a square flag. It resembled the design of the St. Andrew's Cross flag of Scotland. This design on a regular shaped flag was soon deployed by the Confederate Army of Tennessee as well. You may note that the flag here contains 13 stars when only 11 states officially comprise the Confederacy. The Confederacy claimed Missouri and Kentucky, which, as we've noted in previous videos, remain contested border states. By 1863, the Confederate Congress adopted a new national flag. It put the St. Andrew's Cross, the battle flag, in the left top-hand corner, and it had a white background. Now, this soon, of course, had to be abandoned because it was so white that it was often confused in battle with the surrender flag. So near the end of the war, they adopted a red stripe down the end of the flag so you could tell that it wasn't a surrender flag. I should note that the United States never made any changes in its pre-war national flag because it never recognized the Confederacy. So the stars on the national U.S. flag, they remained as they had before the war. Shifting gears a bit, I want to talk a little bit about military strategy. Most battles, certainly earlier in the war, still incorporated the traditional frontal assault. Both sides would line up opposite each other and charge. This tactic, however, proved outdated as the war progressed because, weapons and strategies just got too advanced and deadly. This kind of dates from the day and age when people had muskets and you had to get close to really kill your enemy. Both sides in the war began to build elaborate lines of trenches and fortification, and they're difficult and often impossible to break with frontal assaults. When they started building these a number of generals would just keep throwing their men at it, and it was a slaughter. Increasingly, flanking attacks were their strategy for dealing with these entrenched lines. You would keep a force in front of the line to keep it occupied, but you would send the majority of your troops around the end of the entrenched lines. And that was perfect because if you get around it, if they were defending the line and shooting at you because you come around, you'd often hit themselves because they were all lined up. Meanwhile, if you were attacking them and you missed your intended target, the bullet would often hit somebody else because they were right behind them. You may have already picked up on some of this as I've talked about flanking attacks and some of the battles I mentioned in previous videos. Finally, with increasing frequency, both sides tried what was called a turning movement of maneuver. It usually was by a small, often cavalry force, and they would advance quickly far behind the enemy lines to cut off the enemy supply routes. And you can see Grant tried this a couple times I've mentioned. And that as time went on, the defensive commanders would not worry extensively about that, but so they wouldn't send their whole army down, which was what of course the attackers wanted. But they would send enough men that they could block and protect the supply lines. In terms of weapons that the soldiers used, there was dramatic improvement during the war. Necessity, of course, is the mother of invention. Initially, both sides had some what were antiquated flintlock muskets, as you can see here, but that didn't last long. Within a year or so, both sides had settled on their particular favorite rifle. The North preferred the 58 caliber Springfield, shown here, which had a 500 grain bullet with a maximum range of about 500 yards. It could be fired 6 times in a minute, and it was named after the armory which produced them in Springfield, Massachusetts. The South didn't have an armory capable of producing enough rifles, so it often imported the British-made Enfields, which is shown here. Similar to the Springfield, the Enfield rifle fired smaller bullets, which became known as Mini balls. It was named after its creator and pronounced in the U.S. as Mini. Cavalry used shorter rifles, known as carbines. The Confederate cavalry also employed short but heavy shotguns, and of course cavalry on both sides used sabers or swords. Both sides rushed into development new repeating rifles. The North, later in the war, developed the Spencer carbine, which you can see here, which could fire 7 bullets without reloading. And then really late in the war, they had the Henry carbine, which could fire 15 bullets. You can see here that you load the 6 bullets before the battle in the bottom, and then you'd be able to fire without reloading. I should add that both sides, of course, carried long bayonets, but as the war went on, I mean, the rifles kind of began to make the bayonets obsolete. You couldn't get close enough to hand-to-hand combat. But nevertheless, it was, they both carried them. I have here a statistic, less than 0.5% of the Civil War battlefields deaths were from bayonets. Anyway, in regard to artillery, both sides employed longer range cannons and shorter but heavier shelled mortars where shells exploded. Shells were usually solid shot, and you can see that here, a solid iron bar used to just batter down walls. There was also hot shot, a solid iron ball heated when it hit like a wooden building or a wooden fortification, it would then set it on fire as well as destroy it. In time, they used also shrapnel, which was named for the British general who had earlier designed it. Its ball was hollow and filled with powder, and led smaller balls that sprayed the enemy when it hit. So you can see a picture of that here. They also employed canisters, which are like a tin can filled with powder and lead balls, and often set to a time fuse. I should add that both sides employed dynamite with time fuses when it was needed to destroy structures. And when they were fighting in the trenches in time, what they would do is they would try to dig underneath and set off dynamite. Military intelligence was an important part of the war battles, and both sides gained valuable information in a number of ways. There was the use by the North of hot air balloons. Generals used as well long looking glasses and telescopes. Both sides used scouts ahead and around their armies, as well as information gathered from local civilians. The North found slaves the best information. Designated riders would relay messages whenever telegraphs were not available. Spies were employed by both sides during the war, and I've mentioned in previous videos briefly one famous spy was Alan Pinkerton, shown here. He was a famous Northern spy. After the war, he developed his famous security business. But Pinkerton's intelligence often overestimated enemy strength. And if you listen to the previous videos, you know McClellan was too conservative for Lincoln, and many scholars think that McClellan relied too much on the overly cautious intelligence from Alan Pinkerton. Another famous Union spy was Pauline Cushman, shown here. She was a Louisiana native who had moved to Michigan, and her exploits became famous. Lincoln made her an honorary major in the U.S. Army. After the war, she published a best-selling memoir. Southern spies are not quite as famous, obviously, because, the outcome of the war, they didn't want to get killed. But both sides, by the way, found women the best spies. Yes, even in this day and age, they still didn't expect women to be active combatants. Many people didn't. I've mentioned before, of course, Harriet Tubman, who helped run the Underground Railroad for the war. She was a Union spy in the South during the war. But the spies often relied on secret codes and often employed elaborate ciphers. If you were caught, spies were almost certainly executed. And, both sides during the war developed much better counterintelligence. In addition to espionage, both sides found saboteurs and partisan guerrilla raiders valuable. Saboteurs would cut telegraph wires and blow up railroads or bridges. Confederate saboteurs late in the war even tried to burn New York City in retaliation for the destruction of Sherman's March in Georgia. Raiders were often unorganized or poorly organized, at least. They were kind of small groups of militia that would coordinate an attack, and then they'd quickly escape. They disperse into the country and flee. Perhaps most famous was the Confederate raiders known as Mosby's Rangers, and you can see them on the left here. It was led by John Mosby on the right, you can see. The group, operated in D.C. and Northern Virginia around Washington. Because of the sort of quasi-connection to the military structure, if the Union caught a raider or the South caught a raider, they might not be counted as prisoners of war. They might just be executed. Obviously, being a soldier on both sides was incredibly difficult. For many, joining the Army was the first time they'd ever been away from home. It was also the first time they'd ever received any resemblance of a medical exam. The initial medical exam was, however, kind of a joke by today's standards. They would watch you jump and walk, and then they'd check for any obvious defects. Here you can see a Union soldier in a medical examining tent. In addition to their uniforms, soldiers carried a number of items. They had a haversack, shown on the left here, which was like a large canvas sack with a long straps you could drape around your shoulder. And that's what you'd carry sort of extra gear in. And then you have a knapsack, shown on the right, which would be carried on your back, and which was supposed to be the heavier items. It included your beddings. The knapsack could be hot and heavy, however, and many, certainly Confederates, but Union too, discarded it in favor of putting all their goods either in a rolled up blanket alone on their back or in their haversack and just carrying the beddings on their back. Everything was so heavy and you're marching for so long, you really discarded everything that wasn't absolutely essential. I should note that the word shoddy came into being as Union soldiers described the poor quality of their supplies. Most of the soldiers' time was spent in camp or occasionally moving from one camp to another. They might spend only a few days a year in actual combat early in the war. Now, of course, that's going to change later on with Grant. When you're in camp, most of the time was just mind-numbing boredom. Every morning, soldiers would muster for roll call, and they'd do the same thing at the end of the day. The rest of the day, when they're not just sitting around, was drilling. And drills focused on maneuvering thousands of men in what was the expected smoky and loud conditions of battlefield. With no radios, the Army had to, organize and train to keep chaos from ensuing in an actual battle. Drilling also included, obviously, loading and firing guns. When not drilling, soldiers had several ways to relieve the boredom. They would write letters or play the new sport of baseball. They would play checkers, chess, or cards. They'd even put on plays for their comrades. They'd have debates, or somebody might have a banjo, and they'd play music or whatever. One favorite song was Aura Lee. The tune later, by the way, was used for Elvis Presley's Love Me Tender. They also wrote letters, and it's a war in which a greater percentage of the people were literate, and so we have a lot more of these letters, and we know more of what happened. I actually have a couple letters that have passed down in my family from the Civil War. Since movement was difficult in winter, camps tended to be more structured and developed. They often used or built log cabins and or other wooden structures. And officers would take over local farmhouses for headquarters, and they'd use them for hospitals too. In warm weather, when movement was more likely, the soldiers lived in large tents. And when the army was moving quickly for operations that were expected to be shorter, they'd leave even the large tents behind, and they used tent halves. They were some of the precursors of the modern pup tents. The soldiers' food was usually bland and monotonous. A mainstay of the diet was hardtack, a large quarter-inch thick cracker made from unleavened flour. It could keep for years, but sometimes it got so hard soldiers had to soak it in water just to eat it. Another mainstay was salt pork, which kind of resembled a thick slab of bacon. Fresh pork was, of course, very rare. The other mainstays were beans, rice, vinegar, sugar, salt, and coffee. Sugar, salt, and coffee was increasingly hard to get for the South because of the Union blockade. And of course, as the war went on, I mean, even the mainstays and the basics were any food was hard to get for the Southern forces. Both armies employed chaplains that traveled with the camps. In addition to holding religious services, chaplains nursed the sick, wrote letters for anybody that was injured or illiterate, and they helped with supplies and even, as I'm going to say, joined the fighting in some instances. One of the examples of the ministers who got involved in battle was Leonidas Polk, who was an Episcopal bishop in Louisiana, and he actually served as a general in the Confederate Army. You can see on the right. He was, a cousin of the former U.S. President James K. Polk. He was killed in battle, and when he died, his memorial service became a huge religious ceremony, one of the largest throughout the war in the South. The Catholic priest, Father William Corby, fought with an Irish brigade for the U.S. Army. He would absolve his troops of their sins before battle, but then he would add that if they chickened out and didn't do their duty, God wouldn't let them in heaven. There's a big statue of him at Gettysburg Battlefield today. He later served as president of the University of Notre Dame. Of course, as the Army moved, shadowing them were often, they used to be called camp followers, but people trying to hawk things and prostitutes, and that wasn't as prevalent as in the earlier wars. But one of the group of people that followed, among the group of people that followed the Northern Army, and was Matthew Brady, and he's shown here. I've already mentioned the use of photography in earlier videos, daguerreotype, and the advancements in that way. Matthew Brady would, after the battle, go out and take pictures, and you've seen a lot of his pictures here. He had after the Battle of Antietam, he had a sort of a display of the pictures in New York City, which shocked a lot of people. They'd never seen dead bodies before. You know, everybody thought of war as still being romantic, and you look good in uniform for the ladies, and they weren't really aware of the horror of war. And Matthew Brady's photography really brought that back. If you've ever seen Ken Burns' famous documentary on the Civil War, he employs a lot of these diaries and the photographs of Matthew Brady. In the camps, with all the boredom and monotony, maintaining discipline was always a problem. Early in the war, discipline was especially hard because the men elected officers, as I've mentioned in a previous video, but that stopped pretty quickly. By today's standards, punishments could be harsh. One form of punishment was so-called bucking and gagging. The offender was forced to sit on the ground. His hands were tied to his feet with his knees slightly bent. A stick was then inserted behind the knees, resting on his arms, while another stick was forced into his mouth as a rag, as a sort of a gag. He was then left for hours, and it could get stiff and painful. And of course, you were in public, and everybody was ridiculing you. Bucking and gagging could be used for things like theft or leaving without permission, AWOL, they'd later call it. For less serious crimes, drunkenness, for example, they might do what was called a rogue's march. The idea was simply humiliation. With the guy's head shaved and a sign draped around his neck, he'd be marched through the camp while musicians played a mocking tune and soldiers carried their guns backwards. Of course, for the most serious crimes, direct disavowal of an order, murder, or cowardice, the criminal could be locked into a stockhouse or court-martialed formally. That was a militia trial that could result in serious prison time. Like all wars, if you disobeyed an order while in the combat, you could be summarily executed. There were actually few formal military decorations for those soldiers that performed heroically. Officers feared that rewarding a few could hurt the cohesiveness of the unit and sort of hamper morale. They often, therefore, recognized brigades or regiments for collective heroism, allowing them special markings on their flags. The U.S. Congress did establish in 1861 one important medal, the Medal of Honor, shown here. This is still the nation's highest decoration for bravery, for combat service way beyond the call of duty. The Confederate Congress authorized several medals, but never got around to awarding them to individual soldiers. In the field and in lieu of other formal decorations, officers were often, given what was called brevet promotions. He was allowed to use the title of a higher rank, but didn't get the pay that usually came with it. What you probably didn't want to happen if you were a soldier was to be captured, because prisoner of war camps are horrible. The armies on both sides drew up codes of conduct for their soldiers, but initially, after capture at least, many prisoners were beaten. Without facilities or plans to handle the prisoners, both armies did what Europeans had often done. They would exchange prisoners. It was less costly or a hassle. This system broke down, however, by late 1862 for obvious reasons. The Union Army didn't want to resupply Confederate forces when it had its numerical superiority. The Confederates also refused to treat black Union soldiers as soldiers. For a while, there were several famous incidents in which prisoners were killed in retaliation for battles. By 1863, both sides developed a series of prisoner camps. Some Union prisons were converted forts. And, both sides kept their prisons barely with the minimum. And like I say, treatment could be harsh. The worst prison in the North was considered Elmira, New York, known as Helmira. Sanitation and food was horrible, and many died there. Obviously, as the war turned against them, southern camps were even worse. I mean, there were no supplies at all, almost. Here, the worst was Andersonville, Georgia, which you can see here. It was erected to hold 2,500, but it actually held 10,000. And people didn't have adequate shelter. They're just in a big field, and they were forced to eat things like acorns just to survive. It was expanded, but not adequately as the war went on, and by the end of the war, it held 30,000. After the war, Andersonville's commandant became one of the few soldiers that was executed for war crimes. Here's a picture of a prisoner of war. It looks like something you might see out of the Holocaust. They just didn't have enough food to feed them. This concludes the video on the hard life of a soldier in the Civil War.